Hello, everybody, and welcome to this somewhat short lecture on psychological research. We begin with an understanding that in order to do research, it's important and critical to have a certain stance or certain set of attitudes. First of all is the notion of critical thinking. As we mentioned in an earlier lecture, critical thinking is simply a cognitive stance we have toward the world in which we're constantly asking questions about the information and data that comes our way. We don't assume that what we hear or read or see online is necessarily accurate, or if I could put it another way, completely accurate. The world is full of information which on the surface looks one way, but when we delve a little more deeply, for instance, we examine the assumptions that are made with this essay or this research study, the hidden values that are freighted sometimes with statements, the problem with evidence not necessarily being foundational or underlying the conclusion from evidence. All of these things are part of critical thinking and certainly part of research in psychology. In addition, as historians of science have pointed out numerous times, we want to come at psychological research with three very important, attitudes. We want to, first of all, be very curious about ourselves, about the world. Curiosity is what importantly gets us to ask the questions, hey, what's really going on here? And it's important. Secondly, we want to be skeptical, not skeptical in a kind of profound sense, like the skepticism I sometimes run into where people say, well, nothing can be known, and why bother? And but a skepticism which says, wait a second, you tell me that this answer is true. Is it? Is there something else going on here? Is there something a little more complicated? That's the idea of skepticism, is just not necessarily accepting what we hear or see or read as being the whole truth and nothing but the truth. And finally, and I think very importantly, in psychological research, we always need to be really, really humble. And by humble, I particularly mean the attitude that we may think so often that we know what's going on. But humility prompts us to really ask the question, wait, do I really have a full picture as to what is going on? And so if we take curiosity, skepticism, and humility, it goes a long way toward providing the important attitudinal, perspective as we seek to move ahead and build on the research foundation that we want in psychology. Psychology, like just about every scientific field, uses the scientific method as a way of trying to get at what is true and what isn't true. And so with regard to the scientific method, and again, this isn't just unique to psychology, we always begin with theories. Now, sometimes when I hear the word theory, my mind just gets bored and my eyes glaze over. But you and I have theories about everything. You can't come at the world without theories. Theories are just simply our estimate or our guess as to why things are the way they are, or why they work that way. I have a theory when I go into a restaurant as to which meal I will like the best. I have a theory when I drive from one place to another about how fast, what's the fastest way to go. When I meet somebody, I have my own theories, even if I'm not aware of them, as to whether this person can be considered trustworthy or not. So a theory is just a guess, an estimation as to what's going on. And so in the particular case that you have in front of you, we certainly in psychology have had these theories about how low self-esteem and depression seem to go together. And so let's say that my theory is that, hey, low self-esteem, having an inadequate view of yourself, causes and feeds depression. Once we have our theories in the scientific method, we want to come up with a hypothesis that we can test. An hypothesis is simply a best guess as to if we did X, what would happen, what Y would occur. So a hypothesis is just simply laying out, as best we can, a kind of prediction as to what we think in this particular situation, what will happen if we do this, what is the results. And then finally, we actually then go ahead and do that. We actually go ahead and test through a research experiment, through some kind of observation, whether our hypothesis is indeed borne out by the actual evidence. So the scientific method essentially goes in a big circle. Once we have the information that our observations or a research study give us, we complete the circle by going back and fine-tuning or adjusting our theories. If the theory doesn't predict what actually happens, then quite frankly, ladies and gentlemen, we need to change the theory. Just as an aside, an editorial comment, one of the problems in life is that we as human beings make some observations, we come up with our theories, and then when our theories don't work in the world, instead of changing our theories and adjusting them, we simply start to ignore the evidence. So the world is full of people that have latched onto theories, be they political or religious or who knows what. I'm a Democrat, I'm a communist, I'm a Seventh-day Adventist, whatever. I hope it's not offensive, but in some ways our theological stance, our religious stance is a theory. As the evidence comes forward about something, ideally we want to question our theories. Maybe I have a theological, just as a for instance, understanding, which indeed, as I look at the evidence of Scripture or the evidence of the way the Lord's working in my life, just doesn't seem to be the case. So ideally, the scientific method should be a self-correcting, circular, kind of a spiral in which we're always increasing the validity and reliability and value of our theories by testing them through hypotheses and then actual research and observations. This evidence that we seek, that's in the middle of step 3 and step 1, is empirical evidence. Empirical just meaning what we can see and observe. This is evidence that we get through, again, as objective as we possibly can, observation, clear and consistent measurement, and a set of principles we set up in terms of appropriate experimentation. This is how things should ideally work. Now, when we look at psychological research, there's a variety of types of research that we just want to mention here, and you'll be reading about in your textbook. There's a series of methods that are called just descriptive methods, and they do exactly as that word says. They describe something. Again, you may recall in an earlier lecture we said one of the goals in psychology is to describe behavior, and accurately. So one type of descriptive method that we use to try and describe are case studies. Case studies are when we go into great depth and detail, usually with a particularly interesting person or situation, or in some cases an animal. So for instance, Washoe, the chimpanzee who learned American Sign Language, or Coco the chimp, or a case study of someone that has a really, really interesting brain disorder, which allows them to engage in some ridiculous task, or they have a brain disorder which prevents them. So, for instance, there's one in which a certain disorder of the nervous system prevents people from feeling pain. So we want to study these people in great and excruciating detail. We're very, very familiar with the second type of descriptive methodology, which is just surveys. Surveys clearly do in some ways the opposite of a case study. Case study, we go really, really deep and get a lot of information about one particular person or group. With surveys, we don't go really, really deep, but we get a lot of information from a lot of people about perhaps their attitudes or about their emotions or behaviors. Clearly the data from surveys is usually a lot. We have a lot of data in those particular surveys. And then finally, naturalistic observation is when we go to a particular real-life situation, maybe a playground, maybe watching people at the airport. I don't know about you, but I enjoy, not for scientific purposes, but just watching people in a park, watching, particularly in another country. I just found that fascinating to watch people's behavior. Well, naturalistic observation is simply when we're looking at real people or animals or subjects in their actual environment. So, and then collect the data. What happens when 20 children go out on a playground and there's 10 boys and 10 girls and they play for 20 minutes. In terms of observing them, we may be able to come up with, some observations about, for instance, how the boys play and interact with each other as opposed to how the girls play and interact with each other. So research methodology that is descriptive, there's several of them. Now, all of these have strengths and weaknesses. And indeed, if we look at case study, the problem with case studies is they give us a lot of information about one person or one group, very, very deep. But the difficulty here is that we run into is, to what extent can we generalize what we observe about one person to everybody else? In other words, we may have a lot of information about a particularly unique person, but can we really take that information and generalize it to everybody? No, it may be such a narrow slice of observation that we need to be very, very careful about saying, well, hey, everybody's like this. Well, not necessarily. How about surveys? Well, the problem with surveys is we've discovered, not only in terms of psychological research, but in terms of recent political surveys, that people don't necessarily always fill out surveys accurately. They may tell people what they think they want to hear and not necessarily what they actually believe. You may recall, as most people do, that in the 2016 presidential election, even up until the day of the election, Tuesday in November, most people thought that Hillary Clinton was going to beat Donald Trump. And the New York Times had an estimator, and they estimated on the beginning of that fateful day in 2016, at least for some people, Hillary Clinton, if I recall, the New York Times estimated that there was a 97% chance that she was going to become president. Well, all of us know how that turned out, and the problem with that is they were basing that on surveys. And you can see that surveys don't necessarily accurately reflect actual human behavior. And finally, naturalistic observation, while having the strength of looking at people in their actual environment, we may have to say, so what? It may not actually reveal anything interesting about why the boys and girls are behaving that way. So I can go on a playground and observe boys and girls behaving and say, hey, there's actual differences. But the reality here with that naturalistic observation is I still have to make theoretical assumptions as to why that is. And the other problem with naturalistic observations clearly is that I can't control for potential variables that may be affecting the behavior that I know nothing about. So for instance, maybe right before the boys and girls came out on the playground, the boys all shared some candy that one boy had smuggled into the school, and without the teacher knowing. And so the boys were all juiced up on sugar. And I'm observing them, and I know nothing about the sugar intake of the boys as opposed to the girls. And as I watch the boys running around like chickens with their head cut off, I may assume that that's just because they're boys, and have no understanding or no idea that sugar may contribute to that behavior. Descriptive research is important for us. It's certainly the vast amount of research we have is descriptive. And we want to simply make the broad observation that we have to be careful, i.e. we have to be as objective and clear as possible in terms of these descriptive methods. And we also have to be careful not to over-infer the results we get from descriptive methodology. A second very important type of research methodology, or large category, is what we call correlation. Correlation is simply when we look at the relationship between two or more variables. We can never, as you can see in red below you, we can never use correlation to say that something causes something else. Correlation just simply says, hey, it seems like people are more depressed on a cloudy day than on a sunny day. Now, if we collect the data and we find out that people do indeed seem to be more depressed or less happy on cloudy days as opposed to sunny days, we find that there's a relationship between those 2 days. But even though it doesn't seem logical, we can't with correlation say that the cloudiness versus the sunniness causes the correlation. Correlation is simply that two things seem to go together. And indeed, there's two general types of correlations, two types of relationships between two variables. Positive correlations would simply be a relationship between two variables in which, as variable A seems to increase, variable B also seems to increase. So a positive correlation isn't necessarily one that's good. The positive in this case simply means that these two variables seem to go up and go down together. So if I could give you a positive correlation that may relate to a college class you're taking, for most people there's a positive correlation between their level of boredom and the amount of time that has gone by since the class began. In other words, think about this. The more time you've been sitting in your class, the more your level of boredom. Now, does the time cause the boredom? No. We can't say that. We just say that there's a relationship. A negative correlation would be not a bad one, but it would be a correlation in that as one variable goes up, the other variable goes down. So for instance, there's probably a negative correlation between the amount of crying that babies engage in during the night and the amount of sleep that parents get. So that the more crying in terms of the baby, the less sleep in terms of parents. Or how about this one? There's probably a negative correlation between the amount of alcoholic drinks that somebody has and their ability to drive carefully. The more alcohol is in a person's system, the worse, the lower driving ability goes. Now, certainly most of us would agree that alcohol has a causative effect and impairs, but if I use correlation, I can simply observe that there is a relationship between the two, but not 100% perfect relationship. So for instance, there's probably people who can drink 2 or 3 glasses of wine and maybe are still better drivers, all things being equal, than other people who drink nothing. They're just really, really bad drivers. So there's a relationship between the two, but it's not exactly causative. Correlation, again, a lot of the research that we have in psychology is correlation. We simply observe that, hey, when this happens, there seems to be a relationship with this. But the thing you always want to remember with correlation is we cannot actually say that A causes B. And in this particular case on your right, does low self-esteem cause depression? Does depression cause low self-esteem? Well, we might observe that there does seem to be a relationship, but we'd have to be careful because chances are both low self-esteem and depression are caused by any number of other things. And so that's the limit of correlation. Finally, we get to experimental research itself. This is when we do an actual experiment. What we do with an experiment is we come up with a hypothesis and then we test it. And I should have put these words in red. Experiments are the only type of research in which we are statistically allowed to say that A causes B or D causes J. And what we do is we get a bunch of research subjects, whether they are rats or people or freshmen or people in a nursing home, and we randomly, hopefully, divide them into two groups, what we call the experimental group. This is the group that we're going to do something to. We're going to add something to their situation. And the control group, this is the group that we're going to try and do nothing to. And then we run our research study and see if there's any difference between the two groups. Now, one of the things you have to remember is that when we have a research study, we always have at least two variables, which we call the independent and dependent variable. So, for instance, look at the example below. Let's say that I want to know, hey, does breastfeeding versus bottle feeding have any impact on IQ? And so as I take that question and I boil it down into a hypothesis and I boil it down into the study, what I do is perhaps I'll recruit 100 moms that have just given birth or that are pregnant, and I randomly divide, if they're all willing and able, them into two groups of 50. My experimental group, let's say, is going to get bottle fed, and my control group is going to be breastfed. I'm going to go ahead and have those babies breastfed or bottle fed until age 18 months, and then I'm going to wait, and when they're 8 years old, we're going to give them all an IQ. Now, in this particular case, I think you can understand that the experimental group would be the bottle feeding and the control group would be the breastfeeding, because that's the natural thing. I think you get that understanding. The independent and dependent variables would be this. The independent variable is the breastfeeding versus bottle feeding. The independent variable is the one in which, at the beginning of my research study, I manipulate. I separate my group into one of two or three groups. The dependent variable is called dependent simply because it's the one I measure at the end of my study. And it's dependent upon which condition the baby was in, the breastfeeding group or the bottle feeding group. This is basically a simple version of all experimental psychological research. We simply narrow our hypothesis down to a particular one or two variables and then try and set up an experimental versus control group and then measure the differences 10 minutes later, 8 years later, whatever. This is what we call, again, experimental research. And here's another one. Let's say I want to see if ginkgo biloba, taking ginkgo biloba every day is going to have a positive impact on memory and cognitive abilities. So in this particular case, if you're looking over on your right, we recruit 230 older adults over age 60. We take we randomly assign 150 people into my experimental group and 115 people into my control group, the placebo. And then what we do is we give both groups a test of their memory and cognitive abilities to make sure that we have a baseline. And we give the experimental group daily doses of ginkgo biloba, and the other group we give daily doses of what looks like the same pill, but it contains nothing, an inert substance. And we simply then test their memory and cognitive abilities and debrief and tell them, all of our subjects, about the research study. And we see, is there a percentage difference from session 1 to session 2 for the people that took the drug when we compare it with the percentage difference from session 1 to session 2 of the people that didn't take the drug. Again, all experimental research is a variation on exactly this theme. Then we report the results, and we're able to see, did our hypothesis, let's say we hypothesized that the ginkgo would have an effect, then we can say, okay, we have some evidence that our hypothesis is true. Now, we might want to follow that up with numerous other research studies. Maybe this group of older adults was particularly, maybe they were all from Florida, or maybe they were all Caucasians. Maybe we want to redo this research study in different areas. Maybe these were mostly women, and we want to see maybe recruit a study of all older men, and so on and so forth. Does ginkgo help younger people? Maybe if we found it did, maybe that would be a good thing for college students to take, and on it goes. This is how we just build the foundation of knowledge we simply have. So just to compare this, descriptive research method studies, we basically observe and describe, record behavior. This involves case studies, surveys, and observations. We don't manipulate anything. We're simply describing what actually exists out there. With correlational research study, we're trying to find out the nature of a relationship between two or more variables. Now, we do use we collect data, and using a statistical method called correlation, logically, we do come up with whether we can actually say that there's a significant relationship between these two variables. And of course, is it a positive one, is it a negative one, or is there really no relationship? We don't manipulate anything. We simply collect the data on this variable and then this other variable and put it into the computer, and it tells us if there's a relationship, but of course, never can tell us that there's a cause and effect relationship. Finally, experimental methodology, which is the gold standard of research methodology. We want to explore cause and effect. Again, we're going to manipulate one or more variables. In the one case, we talked about breast versus bottle feeding, or taking a drug versus not taking a drug. We manipulate the independent variable, and then we measure the dependent variable. And again, there are weaknesses in this. Sometimes one weakness would be that it's, it's artificial. It may not generalize. Our research participants may be particularly a unique group for some reason. But these are all the things we look at. Now, one last comment here. When we do research, as you read in your textbook, or will read in your textbook, you know that there's been horrible examples of research that has been done in the past on human subjects and certainly animal subjects, which is just quite frankly unethical. Your textbook talks about the very infamous Tuskegee experiment, and certainly the Nazis in World War II did horrible unethical research on some of their prisoners, particularly at Auschwitz, on twins, identical twins. And so the American Psychological Association has come up with very, very important principles that have to be addressed and have to be considered in every research study that you do. So let's just go over these quickly. Informed consent simply is that when we participate, when we use human participants, we need to basically tell them what's going to happen. Now, not sometimes everything, because some research studies, you do need a fair amount of ignorance, but informed consent just simply says that participation has to be voluntary, and research participants need to know basically what's going to happen. You can't coerce participants into research studies. Deception can be used in very rare situations, but most deception is problematic. We need to keep confidentiality, particularly a research study in which we're studying very maybe personal behaviors, very behaviors that involve privacy. We want to always maintain confidentiality. And then ideally at the end of the study engage in what we call a debriefing session, in which we pretty much explain why we're doing what we're doing, why we did this, so people leave with all of their questions answered. These ethical rules in most college environments are applied by what's called an IRB, an institutional research board. So for instance, if I wanted to get permission to do this research or that research, I would have to go to my college's IRB and get approval before I'm able to do the research, because the particular college or university doesn't want their name on the front of the research study. That's typically what happens if this is an unethical research study. So I hope this quick survey of psychological research has been valuable to you. Thank you so much.